All right. So here we go. Monday. We're back to the world of history and
It's Tuesday.
Tuesday. Right again. We're back to the world of history, and I kind of decided to back us up a teeny bit because we kept trying to get through things of the Carolingian Empire before break, and then we had snow, and it stopped and went and stopped and went, and in the end of it, we just kind of threw our hands up and said, well, I guess we'll figure this out later. Now is later, and of course now people are sick again, and so this time we're pushing through regardless of which. So hold on tight. We left off with the Carolingian Empire, but just to give us a little bit of a brief review of why this is important, I actually pulled up Daniel chapter 8, because I think it's kind of interesting for the context that we're in. Okay, Daniel chapter 8 says, in the third year of the reign of King Belteshazzar, a vision appeared to me, Daniel, after that which had appeared to me at first. And I saw in the vision, and when I saw, I was in Susa, the citadel, which is in the province of Elam. And I saw in the vision, and I was at Ulai canal. I raised my eyes and saw, and behold, a ram standing on the back of the canal. It had two horns, and both horns were high, but one was higher than the other, and the higher one came up last. I saw the ram charging westward and northward and southward. No beast could stand before him, and there was no one that could make rescue from his power. He did as he pleased, and became great. And I was considering, behold, a male goat came from westward, the face of the whole earth, without touching the ground. And the goat had a conspicuous horn between its eyes. He came to the ram with the two horns, which I had seen standing on the back of the canal, and he ran at him with a powerful wrath. And I saw him close to the ram, and he was enraged against him, and struck the ram and broke his two horns. And the ram had no power to stand before him, but he cast him down to stand on the ground, and was trampled by him. And there was no one who could rescue the ram from his power, and the goat became exceedingly great. But when he was strong, the great horn was broken, and instead of it there came up four conspicuous horns towards the four winds of the heavens. Out of one of them came a little horn, which grew exceedingly great towards the south, towards the east, and towards the glorious land. It grew great, even to the host of heaven, and some of the host and some of the stars were thrown down to the ground and trampled on by them. It became great, even as great as the prince of the host, and the regular burnt offerings were taken away from him, and the place of his sanctuary was overthrown, and the host will be given over to it together with the regular burnt offerings because of the transgressions, and it will be thrown truth to the ground, and it will throw truth to the ground, and it will act and prosper. Then I heard the Holy One speaking to another. Holy One said to the one who spoke, for how long is this vision concerning the regular burnt offering and the transgressions to make desolate, the giving over the sanctuary, and the host to be trampled underfoot? And he said to me, for 2,300 evenings and mornings. Then the sanctuary shall be restored to its full state. Now when I, Daniel, had seen the vision, I sought to understand it, and behold, there stood before me one having the appearance of a man. And I heard a man's voice between the banks of Ulai, and it said to me, and it called, Gabriel, make this man understand the vision. And so he came near where I stood, and when he came, I was frightened and fell on my face. But he said to me, understand, O son of man, that the vision is for the time of the end. When he had spoken to me, I fell into a deep sleep with my face to the ground, but he touched me and made me stand up. And he said, behold, I will make known to you what shall be the later end of the indignation, for it refers to the appointed time of the end. As for the ram that you saw, the two horns are the kings of Media and Persia, and the goat is the king of Greece. And the great horn between his eyes is the first king. As for the horn that was broken, the place where the four others arose, 4 kingdoms shall arise from this nation, but not with his power. And at the latter end of the kingdom, when the transgressors have reached their limit, a king of bold face, one who understands riddles, shall arise. He shall be great but not by his own power. He shall cause fearful destruction, and shall succeed in what he does, and destroy mighty men and the people who are the saints. By his cunning he shall make deceit prosper under the hand, and his own mind shall become great. And without warning he shall destroy many. And he shall even rise up against princes, the prince of princes, and he shall be unbroken, but not by a human hand. The vision of the evenings and the morning that has been told is true, but seal up the vision, for it refers to many days from now. And I, Daniel, was overcome and lay sick for some days. And then I rose about and went to the king's business, but was appalled by the vision, for I did not understand it. All right, super strange vision from Daniel, right? This is also to be taken in addition to Daniel's vision of the mountains, right? Or of the vision of the like the different elements, right? Both of these visions are about several big empires that come up throughout the lands. The first one being the Persian Empire, the next one being the Greek Empire, and then the third one, during the time of Christ, everyone interpreted as the Roman Empire, right? It's the one that kind of crushes everyone who's around it and rises up and takes over the whole world. The Roman Empire comes up, and from the Roman Empire, we have the last of the empires that arises in the midst of the Roman Empire, which Daniel also says is like the little tiny pebble which becomes the really big mountain and ultimately overtakes over everyone else, right? Any ideas what that last empire is supposed to be? So the Greek, or the Persian Empire, the Greek Empire, the Roman Empire. What's the last empire? Come on. It's the little pebble that rises up to the size of a mountain. Should sound somewhat similar to something that our Lord said.
Talking about Christianity.
Yes, yeah, like the kingdom of heaven is like this, right? It's like a mustard seed, which you plant. It's the smallest of all seeds, as our Lord says. You plant it, and then ultimately it grows into this great big plant, and the birds perch in its branches, right? Okay, so the Jewish people, especially during the time of our Lord, were not ignorant of some of these prophecies, especially coming from Daniel. They recognized, okay, so here we have all these empires that are man-made entities, and from them will come something like the kingdom of heaven, which is exactly what our Lord ended up preaching. He ended up preaching the kingdom of heaven. The kingdom is like this, the kingdom is like that, the kingdom is like this. Most people don't realize Christ, during his ministry, used the word gospel very sparingly, right? A couple of major times. He did talk a lot about the kingdom of heaven. Okay, so then kind of fast forward, we think through the Roman Empire. I mean, this is also important to recognize too. If you ever think about like the direction of Christianity, once our Lord comes, what happens? Well, everyone kind of rushes over to Rome, right? Peter and Paul rush over to Rome, and they keep trying to get there. It's like, why? Well, because they know that the visions of Daniel are abundantly clear. From the midst of the Roman Empire, from the center of Rome, will ultimately come this boulder that is started from a little pebble, right? Christ planted the pebble, and everyone's just kind of waiting for this kingdom to overtake all of the other kingdoms. Then we have the fall of the Roman Empire, and kind of in its corpse arises something like Christendom, which is what we had started talking about. Christendom starts. Well, it's kind of actually hard to point to when it starts. We had the Pentarchy, right? Those 5 really important bishops, which are, does anyone remember off the top of their heads from last semester what those ones were? Bishops of Alexandria, Antioch, Jerusalem, Rome, Constantinople. That's right. Yeah, so those 5 important bishoprics become a big pillar of the thing that we're looking at, that we're trying to like figure out, okay, this is Christendom broadly. Of course, once Rome falls, or at least Rome falls in the West, this is a little bit more complicated, because now suddenly you have one of the really important bishoprics, namely the one that Peter and Paul were rushing to, is in the city of Rome, which is now, technically speaking, no longer part of the continuing Roman Empire, or the Roman Empire in the east, or the Byzantine Empire. So now you have them pretty much fractured. And additionally to that, as we talked about on the map that we have over here, everything has kind of become Aryan for a while. There's Aryans in the north, there's Aryans kind of in the south. Muslims have invaded. Spain is pretty much completely Muslim territory at this point. And then there's kind of some percolations of Trinitarian Christianity in the UK, as we know today, in England. They have interesting relationships with Italy. And then a king sprouts up in France. Does anyone remember who that king was? I know this is like going way back to like something we mentioned offhand last semester. But any idea who that king was who sprouts up in France, who ends up becoming the first non-Aryan king in Europe? I'll give you a hint. From his name, we get Louis the First. Let me make sure this stays open. I know, it's so long ago that we talked about this. So Louis, pull like a Lord Voldemort thing with his name. Louis. Clovis. There we go. It seems like a big stretch for us, but that's just simply the C just drops out. I have no idea why, and the U ends up, or the V ends up becoming a U. And so Louis the First, otherwise known as Clovis, becomes the head of the Merovingian Empire. Merovingian. His succession kind of starts off something like a joint reign of at least what we know of today as France. It's divided up with his sons, and it's helpful. It creates a line of Trinitarian Christians that go from basically the city of Rome all the way up to London and even beyond. And so now there's kind of a unified party in the West, right? If the East is more or less doing its thing surrounding Constantinople, the West has that nice little line that runs through there. Does it sound like kind of familiar, right? Okay, we're back, baby. Let's do it. After the Merovingian Empire, it starts to wane. There's a lot of wheels and deals that happen. And in the mid-700s, it begins to kind of fall apart. Especially because of the king just kind of ceases to have power. It's divided up through the sons of the king, and it's split into too many pieces. Until you have Charlemagne. So Charlemagne, otherwise known as Charles the Great, right? Charles Magnus. He took over the Frankish kingdom after his father Pepin's death. Pepin died in 768, and Pepin is kind of the one that begins to reunify the waning France after the Merovingian Empire. With Pepin, we get what we call the Carolingian Empire, because it's named after Charlemagne. Carolingian, Charlemagnian, I guess you can kind of see how they're related to one another. And Charlemagne is particularly notable. If you study anything about Europe, you have some sort of an understanding of Charlemagne. So now we also have a Louis and we have a Charles, right? And if you've ever studied anything about French history, you will know there's a lot of Louis and there's a lot of Charles, right? You have like Charles the 15th and Louis the 15th. They're all kind of simultaneously. Actually, I don't know if they go to Charles the 15th. There's a lot of Charles, but there's a lot more Louis. These are kind of the namesakes of them. We have Clovis and we have Charlemagne. So keep that in mind too. It'll make a lot more sense of European history, and then by the time you get to things like the French Revolution, you'll actually have some reasons to understand, okay, these are where these namesakes are coming from. But that we're not getting to the French Revolution this year. Don't worry, that's way, way in the future. Okay, so Charlemagne, one of the big things that he did is he undertook a lot of military campaigns throughout Europe, 54 in particular. And he wanted to create some sort of reunion between all of Spain, France, what we know of today is like Belgium and Denmark, Switzerland, Austria, and North Italy. If you recall, South Italy, which is basically anything kind of south of Rome or Naples era, is possessed still by the Eastern Empire. But everything north, right here, is kind of owned by the Papal States and stuff like that, and then north, which is, we call it the foot of the mountains, right? This was all owned by or possessed by the Lombards at that point. The Lombards were particularly brutal. I think that they were Aryan, if I'm not mistaken, but they were extremely vicious, and everyone was really terrified of them. One of the big things that Charlemagne did is he came in and he invaded the Lombards. He invaded parts of northern Spain, which is like when we were reading Song of Roland, right? We see him kind of invading the Umayyad the Caliphate, and so there's Muslim forces that are there, and he's trying to push them back. That's not a particularly successful campaign, especially because his rear guard is routed in the midst of that. That's the whole thing with Song of Roland, right? So he crushes the Lombards. He took control of the Lombard state. He takes control of northern Spain, although that's a tricky example. The Basque people, who are the people that actually live in northern Spain, they were the non-Muslim kind of people right here along the Pyrenees. They were kind of standoffish to Charlemagne. They didn't really love his invasion, and so they pushed back quite a bit against it, and it was really difficult for Charlemagne to get through. Nonetheless, he was super successful in Germany. He was successful against the Saxons. So this area that we know today would be Saxony, and this is Germany, more or less, fits on. So all of this he kind of takes over, reunifies Western Europe once again. Okay. So once he had reunified everything, he began to rely on a system of counts, right? This is where we get the idea of like Count Dracula and stuff. We talked about this a little bit a month ago or something like that. He relies on a system of counts. What are counts? Do you remember? Counts. If I was to say, I am the Count of Monte Cristo, what does this mean?
Like you have land that is given to you.
Broadly, yeah, that's actually pretty stinking good. So the counts had been established during the Merovingian Empire, but they really didn't do their thing until Charlemagne came around. So the counts are chief representatives, the people that are going out more or less in the name of the king. They're kind of nobility. I have a weird note here. They represent. Yeah, the chief representatives of the king in local areas. Though they had been set up by the Merovingian dynasty, they really started to grow in power towards the end of this dynasty. Why? Well, because the dynasty itself had been so divided in power. You have different kings, different people that are in charge. And so the counts had given everything some stability, right? If you don't know who's in charge, if no one's in charge of you, at very least you can go to your count, who is more or less a representative of everyone. By the time of Charlemagne, though, these people had begun to have a lot of power over their individual people. We talked about the relationship between subsidiarity, that's a hard word, subsidiarity. And subsidiarity is the idea that you should have the most amount of decision-making processes over the people that you are closest to in relationships, right? So the example I often give of this is the government, by and large, should not be making decisions about when my kids go to bed. Because me as their father should be making that kind of a decision for them, right? Now, even maybe more ideally is we have some sort of autonomy about when we get to make our decisions and stuff like that. But the government may want to be making really, really important decisions, such as like, hey, people shouldn't murder one another, right? And ultimately we know that the government's not the one making these decisions, absolutely, but the government is putting laws and effects and holding people accountable and stuff like this, right? So because there was really no king to rule over everything during the end of the Merovingian Empire, or at least not one that people had direct communication with, these counts became extremely important. Charlemagne wanted to use the counts, but in order to do that, he had to limit their power quite a bit. So he forced them to serve outside, like counts that is, he forced them to serve outside of their family lands and to move around periodically. In other words, if you were going to be a count, that's totally great. You got to represent the king. He liked that, but you had to serve in an area that was not owned by your family. So you couldn't have your own kind of like mini dynasty set up where this was your land and these were your people and you were serving there for the rest of your life and all that kind of stuff. And additionally, every now and then he would move the counts around. This would destabilize the forms of power, so that way they were ultimately relying on Charlemagne more than anyone else. He made their positions to be appointed, so you didn't just like inherit your countship or counthood or whatever you want to call it. You ended up having to be appointed by the king himself. If your dad was a count, if your grandfather was a count, this didn't make a difference. That you weren't necessarily going to be a count unless you were appointed by the king himself. And then he established what's called the Missi Dominici. Missi, M-I-S-S-I, Dominici, D-O-M-I-N-I-C-I. These are just the messengers of the Lord. And so these were two representatives. One was from the state, and the other was from the church. And I think that there were only two throughout the empire, although I could be wrong. There could have been a few more of them, but nonetheless, they would go together in lockstep. And the representative from the state and the representative from the church would go around and check on the counts and make sure that they were exercising their power prudentially, but that they weren't getting too much power to become something that would be able to overthrow the king. And so suddenly you can think of this as a pretty complex system, right, where you have counts overseeing everyone. These counts kind of have their little mini empires, but they're moved around periodically. They're not allowed to own the land that they actually kind of rule in, and they represent the king. You have the Missi Dominici that's going around and checking up on all the counts. Charlemagne is doing his ravaging of all of Western Europe at this point. And there's kind of a cohesive system that's beginning to take shape. Now, unfortunately, even though this was a pretty ingenious system, Europe's really stinking big. And so it had its kind of mixed reviews as far as whether it worked or not, because at the end of the day, right, if a count ends up becoming corrupted and exercising more power than able, it's really difficult to keep very close eyes on them, even with the Missi Dominici. So it kind of worked, it kind of didn't. Another thing that Charlemagne started to do is he started to really crack down on making sure that the church leaders were of a certain quality, and that there was enough quantity of them as well, too. So there were a lot of positions up until this point in like far Western Europe, France and Spain, where there were not enough bishops, and so he made sure to institute more bishops. Archbishops were instituted as well, too. There was more of a vetting process for who would end up becoming a bishop, and he saw the relationship between the church and the relationship between what we might consider broadly the state or these states to be really, really important. And so he kept pretty good ties with the Pope during this time, and all was more or less hunky-dory. So, as a result of both Pepin and Charlemagne's rules, the popes continued increasingly to turn their attention to from the east to the west. So rather than looking along the lines of, okay, these are the 4 other pentarchies, the Bishop of Rome kept thinking, okay, we kind of have our own thing going over here in the west. And this is not an insignificant kind of change of attention, right? Because up until that point, there was, broadly speaking, a recognition that like these bishops needed to work in lockstep with one another, right? There would be moments in which the bishops would disagree about something, and there'd be theological discrepancies, and they would meet together and all this kind of stuff. But there was not like a lot of testing of what happens when one of the bishops, especially the Bishop of Rome, is kind of pulled out of that pentarchy as far as like direct communication and who they're primarily interested in, right? And so from this point, you can start to see a very sharp distinction between what we think of as the East, or Orthodoxy, maybe even both Eastern and Oriental Orthodoxy, and the West, which is going to be the Pentarchy -4, with just the Pope at this point. Does that make sense? Can I see? And so you can see how this bishopric is going to have a particularly notable influence on everyone there. Okay, so in 799 AD, Pope Leo III was being targeted, I believe, from forces from the east. And so he fled from Rome up north through the mountains there, the Alps, and into France. and Charlemagne took care of him. He was protected by Charlemagne, and this created a particularly important moment of church history, because as a response, when Leo was able to get back to Rome, which he was, he had to flee for several months, he came back to Rome, he invited Charlemagne down, and on Christmas Day, the year 800, he crowned him as king of the new Romans, king of the Roman Empire. Basically something that will end up morphing into the Holy Roman Empire. It's not quite there yet, but now we have Charlemagne as king of the Romans. Now this is a particularly shrewd move, and there's a lot of debate as far as, did Charlemagne want this to happen? Did he not want it to happen? And what in the world does king of the Romans mean? Because you have to keep in mind, there's no Roman territory at this point in the West, at least. Maybe the East can kind of have some ties and say, hey, we're still doing the Roman thing. In the West, Rome has been gone for, a couple hundred years at this point, maybe even 300 years, depending on how you want to measure it. And so, why do you think Leo wants to crown him as king of the Romans? Any thoughts?
Would it have being the king giving the power to benefit Leo?
Benefit the what?
Leo in some way?
Ultimately, yes, it will benefit Leo in some way, but why king of the Romans? What is the significance of this kind of idea? Think about this. You have the East doing its East thing, right? They still have a tie to Rome. Again, we call them the Byzantine Empire, but you could just call them the Roman Empire. Now suddenly, the West, which was a bunch of different fractal things, is coagulated into some whole through Charlemagne. And you have Leo basically saying, you, Charlemagne, are king of the Romans. The East has their emperor, So they're still having emperors, they're still doing their East thing, right? There's still a patriarch of Constantinople, that archbishopric in Constantinople, who has a relationship with the emperor. And now you have a king in the West as well, too. And the king in the West and the Pope are buddy-buddies. So this is a pretty complicated situation that you suddenly have. You have two wings, if you will, of the Roman Empire. And so basically the West is trying to reclaim that name of we are Romans. Genuinely, we are Romans. And so again, go back to Daniel, this idea that from the tiny pebble which is placed in the Roman Empire comes this whole mountain of Christendom, right? People are reinterpreting that and they're thinking, okay, this is what this looks like. This is the fulfillment of Daniel's prophecy. Okay. Anyways, this put Charlemagne on equal footing with the Byzantine Emperor, and then with this coronation, we see a full fusion of the Roman Empire, the Christian world, and the Germanic Empire. The Germanic Empire, again, I say Germanic, is just the people that kind of came from over here-ish, broadly, all the way through France, Spain, that kind of stuff as well, too. And so now it's fused into something that we kind of know of as Christendom. And that's what we mean by Christendom. We mean this relationship between church and state, where the king or the emperor is having some sort of relationship with the bishops, and the pope is kind of thrown in there, and everything is loosely held together. Okay. Another thing that's really interesting about the crowning of Charlemagne, this establishes some sort of question of who is actually in charge of whom, right? It's notable that Charlemagne had to go to the Christmas service, right? It would have been a day of holy obligation, which means that as a Christian, he would have been required to show up, and he shows up, and the Pope crowns him as king, even though the Pope was just subservient to him and needed his protection and stuff. What do you think the Pope is actually, what is Leo III actually saying in crowning him?
I have no power.
Yeah, you might have earthly power, but my power is divine, and so I'm crowning you with the earthly power that you have. Yeah, it's a pretty big move. And you can imagine this ruffles some of the feathers of the people in the East as well, too. And even people in the West that are saying, hold up. Can the Pope do that? Do we do that now? Okay, so it's a pretty big statement that happens there. You'll see a lot of famous paintings and depictions. Last year for this class, I had Charlemagne being crowned King of the Romans, a very famous painting. I had it for like the course canvas picture. Maybe I'll put it up again. So you can see that. You've probably seen it at some point. We'll look at it later. But Charlemagne did a couple of other things while he was in power. We could really talk about Charlemagne's rule for a very, very long time, but you should know that he had a big emphasis on education. So at that point, the West was largely broken up into different groups. Farming, as we'll see, was the predominant way that the city or the civilization cared for itself. They weren't super interested in trade or anything at this point. Charlemagne emphasized education is really important. If we're going to be a unified whole in any sense, we need to make sure that our individual members are educated. He picked up Cassiodorus's 7 liberal arts tradition, and he started infusing that into the entirety of the Roman education system, which of course is how you get classical education. In other words, you are a direct, or at least the school is a direct result in some sense of Charlemagne's reform on education, which is kind of cool. He ended up preserving a lot of the Latin and Greek literature as well, too. So at this point, there would have been a ton of stuff lost had Charlemagne not made extreme strides to preserve the Latin and Greek literature of the East and the West. He would do this especially through scriptoriums, so you'll see sometimes that some of the different monastery monks would sit down and they'd be copying things by hand. There was kind of a whole tradition that evolved around this time. It had been going on in Ireland for already a few hundred years, but this was brought broadly into the rest of like the continental Europe. And so thanks, Charlemagne. Without you, we would not have the works of Aristotle or of Plato or of many others as well, too, if he did not emphasize the importance of keeping them. Okay. Charlemagne was ultimately succeeded by his son. Now we get to another Louis. We're oftentimes going back between Charles and Louis and Charles and Louis. Charles gave birth to a son. Louis, we're going to know him as Louis the Pious. So again, this is just Clovis's name represented. But at this point, like, French is kind of developing into its own thing apart from Latin. And so Clovis just ends up becoming Louis, and then just the C drops and it's Louis, which is, I think, kind of a fun little idea. After Louis kind of held things together, but he died in 843, and his kingdom is divided between the 3 sons that he has. And this division is known as the Treaty of Verdun, V-E-R-D-U-M. This treaty is pretty stinking important because it's going to divide what was a unified Holy Roman Empire, or unified Roman Empire, pardon me, in the West into 3 sections. One, pretty much everything west of, well, actually, if you imagine Italy will run kind of as the spine of this. So one is this western section that includes France and Spain. One is the eastern section, which is more Germany and kind of Poland area, although that's more in the east. Austria will be included here. And the other is this middle section, which is extremely slender, but also includes the entirety of the Alps right here, and it includes the most populous section of the known world, which is northern Italy. It's worth keeping in mind that during this time, London would have been about, I want to say, 90,000 people-ish. And it was the biggest city outside of Italy. Italy had many cities that were in the hundreds of thousands. So like the rest of the world comparatively, I mean, this is like when we're reading Dante, right? Everyone is Italian, right? There's some major Italian city. And this is obviously true if you look at like the trade routes and stuff. In order to get anything in Europe, either you're going all the way around Spain and the Strait of Gibraltar or something like that, or you're going to Italy. This section kind of becomes the hub of everything. So when the kingdom is divided, this middle section is just extremely overpowered as far as what it's worth. So as it's divided, the Treaty of Verdun divides it into 3 sections. You have, these are lovely names, by the way. Charles the Bald, B-A-L-D, like that kind of bald. He inherits the western portion. So France, Spain, what we think of today at least. Then we have Louis the German, and as you might imagine, he inherits the Germanic section, right? Not just what we think of as modern day Germany, but kind of everything over in the barbarian German lands and stuff like that. And then we have Lothair, who inherits that coveted middle section, known as the Middle Kingdom. This starts pretty much everything in the North Sea and goes all the way down through the Papal States. Remember, Lothair, Lothair, Lothair. So, of course, this kind of makes his brothers a little bit angry based off of the fact of what he gets. His relationship with the Papal States is super interesting. We don't need to get into all of it now, but you should recognize the Papal States are kind of a big question right now. They weren't formally possessed by the Lombards, but while the Lombards were Lombarding, they had a lot of influence over the Papal States, and so there's kind of some questions as far as how much Lothair actually possessed those, and to what degree the Pope was still ruling them, but that's neither here nor there for now. During the 9th and 10th centuries, there were a ton, and I mean like a ton, of invasions that took place from 3 different groups that's ultimately going to refractal the unified kingdom. So the first group of people is the Muslims. We've seen them. They've been doing a lot of stuff, but last time we left them, they were kind of in Spain. They get pushed back by Charlemagne's empire. So they more or less retract to here, but they're still all along this southern area, northern Africa. They overtake Sicily, and they overtake that southern area of Rome, or of Italy, pardon me, just everything south of Rome, which had been at that time owned by the Byzantines, or possessed by the Byzantines. I think they also take over Corsica and Sardinia as well. So they start kind of propping up, getting a little bit closer to the city of Rome, and start taking sections of Italy. After that also comes the Magyars. They come from the east. They're ultimately going to be converted into Christianity and settle down in modern-day Hungary. So they end up making it from like over here. People just like pop up in the east, right? They start attacking, and they more or less, they're converted, and they retreat back over to here. They settle down in Budapest, and you get them to be doing their thing. And then finally, last but not least, are the Vikings. And the Vikings are the most famous probably, right? Vikings are crazy during this time. So they had, just war in general is kind of crazy. The Eastern Empire had its special fire techniques. Do you remember we talked about this? They would blow fire from ships on the Muslim invaders, and so they'd shoot it out. I forget. There was a technical term for it. It would terrify them, as you can imagine, because you're just like out in the sea getting ready to conquer, and suddenly they just like flamethrower fire at you. So that was pretty cool. The Vikings had kind of similar techniques where they would carve up their ships to be these dragon-like things that were really long and slender, and so they'd be able just to go extraordinarily fast. They came from a lot of the northern areas, and they just liked to go around and conquer. So they came from the north, they of course going all the way as far as the Americas. But when they came down, unlike the Muslims focus on this area, we have what ends up becoming the Hungarians focus on like this area. The Vikings go everywhere. They go Spain, they go France, they go Italy, they go Germany, they just take over everything. But what's really interesting about them is that they come in, they invade, and almost every single time they end up converting to Christianity and integrating into the system. It's a very interesting dynamic that they have. So although they're pretty vicious, it ultimately becomes this kind of weird way of integrating another foreign nation into the hodgepodge of the European system that they have. So they largely settle down. And all of this upsettling after the Carolingian Empire kind of hits its peak and then starts to crash a little bit, causes a need to restructure this whole system of counts and kings and things like this. So what ends up happening is during the 8th century, so remember the 1st century is like everything up and prior to 100, so you have to kind of always add an extra year to, or subtract an extra year to it. So the 8th century, the system of vassalages and lords and fiefs ends up taking shape. So what this looks like is an individual would serve as a lord in a military capacity. So once they were serving as a lord, they were known, pardon me. Yeah, so once they were serving as a lord, they were known as a vassal. They were someone that swore an oath to a military leader. Okay, so there's a military leader, swears an oath. That person is known as a vassal. There were a lot of reasons that the military, as it expanded and as technology increased, required more extensive training than it had previously done. Up until this point, if you were fighting in battle, you're probably doing it on foot, or if you were lucky enough to be able to have a horse, you would have things that you would throw from your horse, or you would shoot off of your horse, like bows and arrows and stuff, and you would stay super far back. But during Europe, they had intentionally bred a lot of the horses to be a bit stronger, and to be able to actually carry like a fully armed knight, if you will. Someone that's in chainmail, someone that has like a lance, all the big sword and stuff like this, and is still able to run at full speed. This completely changes the military during this time. Because now, suddenly, not only are these horses worth training and worth investing a lot of money in, but the people that are able to ride on these horses and fight on these horses suddenly are in a very, very privileged position as far as they're highly trained, they're probably highly educated, they have a lot of cost that's associated with them. And so if you want to build up your military, it went from basically having a bunch of peasants running at one another with swords, and really you need to strategize how all of this works, to you have to have like these highly trained and skilled, not assassins, but military figures. In order to do this, this meant that you had to be able to pay them, and in order to pay them, you had to have quite a bit that you wanted to offer them. And so the solution for this was saying, okay, here's what we'll do. If you are going to be a knight, as these people ended up becoming known as, if you wanted to be one of these highly trained individuals who would ride on horseback into combat, I'll give you, let's say I'm the acting like lord in this situation, or I'm the acting military leader, I will give you some land. And you can run that land, you can own that land, and as a response, you will fight in my military campaigns when I need you. This is going to be really, really important for transforming how the whole system of land ends up working in Europe, but we don't have time to talk all about it. We'll finish this conversation tomorrow. Any questions? Sleepyheads? All right, I'll cut this off. Your peers are going to love watching while they're sick.